Okay, so big things have changed. Acadia now is actually or mainland Nova Scotia is actually a British possession. Okay, and that's significant because we still have a number of Acadians who are living there. In fact, in terms of Europeans, it's mostly Acadians. Of course, there are the larger population is the Mi'kmaq population that's there at this time. But this is going to create a challenge for both the Mi'kmaq and the Acadians. Now, the British take over and they say, well, we're in charge now, so I guess that means you're going to swear an oath of loyalty to us. The Acadians are very resistant. They refuse and instead say that they will have an oath of neutrality, okay, that they will pledge not to go to war against for Britain or for France, okay? And so the British reluctantly agree to that. And so what we have happening then after 1713 is we have a British possession, mainland Nova Scotia, full of Acadians and Mi'kmaq and very, very small, virtually no British kind of presence there. So it's kind of a period of phantom rule for the British there. And that's going to be important to keep in mind as we move on. Now, the French, despite the fact they lost mainland Nova Scotia, wanted to keep their they very much wanted to kind of have a presence there. Cape Breton Island, or what was then known as Ile Royale, was still a French possession. And so in 1720, they built kind of a major fort at Fortress Louisbourg. And there they wanted to kind of use that as kind of a base to support Acadians if there ever should be another war with the British. They also wanted to encourage, they were more than happy to kind of encourage Mi'kmaq allies to maybe make some raids on British posts or fishing posts that were on mainland Nova Scotia. And so they were going to use this as kind of a base. And indeed, one of the issues that we're going to see throughout this period of time is tensions between the Mi'kmaq and the British authorities. And indeed, these tensions actually were not only between the Mi'kmaq, but other First Nations in the region, something known as the Wabanaki Confederacy, which include the Mausi, the Passamaquoddy, and the Abenaki. Okay, and they had been actually in a series of wars throughout New England during the early 1720s. These also spill over into Nova Scotia, and the Mi'kmaq are going to create a challenge for British authorities there. Eventually, a treaty will be signed, and the first of many treaties that will be known as treaties of peace and friendship. That'll be between the British and the Mi'kmaq. That'll take place in 1725, 1726. And we'll see later treaties in the 1750s and 1760s as well. I want you to take note of the term treaties of peace and friendship, okay? These treaties, unlike the treaties that we talk about a little bit later when we get to the 1800s, where we sort of see treaties that are going to result in a kind of transfer of land or surrender of land. This is not about surrender of land. These are treaties about we agree to kind of live together, okay, or in peace, and in exchange you're going to let us live our life and we'll kind of let you live your life. That's kind of what they say. Okay? So they're very different treaties and there's no kind of giving up of land. Okay. The other thing, and those, despite these treaties, there will be tensions periodically between the Mi'kmaq and the British. Now, the Acadians during this period of time, this period between 1713 and to the 1750s, this is a period known as kind of the golden age of Acadia. Okay, it's a period of tremendous relative prosperity. There lots of population growth, a fair amount of peace, at least until the 1740s. And it's kind of viewed as kind of this kind of crucial moment in kind of development of kind of an Acadian sensibility a sense of a people, but also, as I say, it's kind of viewed as a golden age during this time. So that's what's going on in Acadia. If we think about New France, okay, if we think about the economy in New France at this time, more or less the same as we've seen before. The fur trade remains important, but we're kind of self-sufficiency, agriculture, there's a bit of timber, so the economy is more or less staying the same. All those kind of things that have been implemented under Louis XIV in terms of a government structure and judicial and all that sort, that continues to exist as well. The one thing that is interesting is that as New France tries to France tries to kind of establish its claim to the interior of North America, it makes a series of, many kind of alliances with various First Nations throughout the interior. And you probably remember some of the maps that we showed you, which kind of showed you that the claims of France to really a good chunk of North America. You've got the eastern seaboard of what is today the United States, which is firmly British, but all the way down to the Mississippi and to the Gulf of Mexico, France was claiming that. And they were largely doing on the basis of these alliances they had with various First Nations. Those alliances, based on something known as gift diplomacy, kind of the regular giving of gifts, a participation in the fur trade, all of those things allowed those alliances to continue, and they become very important. And they're very successful because they actually hem the British in. The British can't move westward because of those alliances with First Nations. So even though the population of New France is 10% of that of the British colonies to the south, they are able to kind of basically hem Britain in. It's quite remarkable. Okay, let's move the story up a little bit here. So, I mentioned earlier that the long 18th century is a period of a lot of imperial wars that spill over into North America. Here's another one in the 1740s, War of the Austrian Succession. You don't need to know why the War of the Austrian Succession took place. But what is important is that it spills over into North America. And once again, we'll sort of see, folks in New France and folks in New England are going to, launch raids after one another. One thing that's becoming clear is the folks in New England are getting kind of irritated about this Louisburg, which is based in Cape Breton. Okay, they don't like this kind of French military fort so close to New England, and so they're getting concerned about that. A raid will be launched against Louisburg, and in fact, in 1745, Louisburg will be captured and eventually destroyed. But at the end of the war in 1748, Louisburg goes back to, or Ile Royale and Louisburg go back to the possession of New France, and New France, or France, kind of rebuilds the fort. Okay, so that's what's happening. So this conflict that takes place here, and I should say that it also spilled over into Acadia, and indeed the British were very suspicious that the Acadians were not being neutral like they promised they would be. And there were a number of raids that had been launched by the Mi'kmaq, and the British kind of retaliated on Acadian communities. So there is growing conflict there as well. So this period between 1744 and 1748, when this war is over, the war actually begins a bit earlier in Europe, but in North America, it's here. It ends in 1748. it's almost like we move into a period of Cold War, okay, where everyone knows the big war is going to come, okay, that the tensions have been building, the treaty really didn't solve anything, and so we move forward. Because of the tensions, because of the concerns of the British, and particularly those in New England, about what was going on in Acadia, they decided that it was time to actually ramp up the population, the British population in Nova Scotia. And so in 1749, they established a fairly significant settlement at Halifax on traditional Mi'kmaq land, which is going to create tensions between the Mi'kmaq again. They also established a settlement they bring in German Protestants, they call them, and to live in Lunenburg, okay, on the south shore of Nova Scotia. The idea here is to kind of counteract that Acadian presence, okay, and so we start to see, and so tensions are starting to build in Nova Scotia. By the way, I forgot to mention that in 1713, when Acadia becomes a British possession, they change the name to Nova Scotia. Okay, so we're getting increased tensions there. Okay, now here's the big war. Okay, this is a really important moment, the 7 Years' War that takes place. Now, in Europe, the 7 Years' War runs from 1756 to 1763. In North America, it actually begins 2 years earlier. In fact, in North America, it is known as the French and Indian War. It goes from 1754, and by 1760, the war in North America is over. Okay. Now, this conflict, again, about a whole lot of things in Europe that you don't need to worry about, but in contrast to some of the other conflicts we've talked about, North America becomes a very significant theater of battle. And indeed, the war takes place. One of the first things that happens early in the conflict, now the conflict begins in kind of we start to see kind of ramping up of tensions in the Ohio Valley and places like that. In Nova Scotia, the British are very concerned about the loyalty of the Acadians. So in 1755, they say, okay, well, we're going to ask you to take an oath of loyalty one more time, Acadians. And the Acadians, again, say, no, well, we'd like to be neutral, just like we always were. And this time, the British say, okay, we're going to send you away. And so this is when the deportation of the Acadians takes place, where basically the British kind of empty out Nova Scotia, send the Acadians and their families, sometimes splitting them up, to all parts of North America and sometimes in Europe as well. And so now Nova Scotia is largely empty of an Acadian presence. There are Acadians on Ile Saint-Jean as well, which is now known as Prince Edward Island. They too were sent, would be deported over the next few years. So between 1755 and 1758, we see the kind of the deportation of the Acadians. Okay, that's an important one. When that happens, the other thing that's going to happen as well is that the British are going to get very serious about this conflict. They engage the Royal Navy and put a lot of resources to trying to kind of take over New France once and for all. 1758, they're going to attack Louisbourg. Louisbourg is going to fall. This is a really important, okay, because when Louisbourg falls, okay, it means that the French can no longer control the St. Lawrence River like they used to, okay? And almost immediately, we're going to see fewer goods kind of getting into Quebec from France, which means there are fewer goods to trade with the First Nations allies who are in the interior, okay? I mean, we talked about all that gift diplomacy here, okay? All that gift diplomacy. So that is going to be, that's no longer possible or there's going to be fewer goods available, what's going to happen is some of those alliances are going to break apart. There's also going to be, the British are going to kind of make a number of attacks on some of these allies as well. And eventually, there will be there will be an agreement between many of the First Nations and the British to basically kind of a peace, which means that the French in New France kind of they're losing some of their allies. They have to defend themselves, and eventually in 1759, 1760, the British are going to attack, one last attack, and the Battle of Plains of Abraham will take place in September of 1759. Eventually, by 1760, Quebec or New France is going to surrender. Okay? Now, there's a whole lot of reasons why France kind of loses here. Really not going to get into it right now, but there was some discussion about it in the lectures. But I mean, kind of pay attention to that. This is a key moment. Okay, the war ends. The war doesn't officially end until 1763, but in North America, it's pretty much over in 1760. Okay, now. I should mention that one of the things that happens is that many of the First Nations in the interior of North America, who had been allied with the French, had great concerns about the British. Remember, the British population is 10 times that of the French population in North America, and there was a real and the New England colonies or the British colonies were, establishing, plantations, large farms. There was a real concern that for Indigenous people that they were going to lose their land. That with the French gone, the French allies gone, that the British would just expand westward. And so, and I should mention that one of the reasons the First Nations were so, are willing to kind of support the French was they were viewed as less of an existential threat than were the British. The numbers were smaller, they weren't kind of farming in the same intensive way, all of those kinds of things. Okay, so that's important context because in 1763, an Ottawa chief by the name of Pontiac basically begins to kind of organize First Nations throughout the interior of North America. There's a series of raids that are made on British posts and also in the Great Lakes region, and it provides a real challenge to the British. And the British are very concerned about the threat from, the military threat from the First Nations. Consequently, when the British in 1763 decide to establish basically they issue this royal proclamation. Okay, the royal proclamation of 1763 is basically setting up the ground rules. How is New France, which now becomes known as Quebec, how is it going to be governed under a British regime? And it has a whole range of things. I'm going to talk about some of them in a second. But for our purpose, to kind of finish our story here, is one of the things it does is it almost kind of as a nod to some of the challenges created by the Pontiac and the concerns about the First Nations as a military threat, is that it says it establishes these lands, which are basically indigenous lands, which are kind of a strip that runs through the interior, kind of just west of British settlements in what is today the United States, and basically says these lands are off, are out of bounds for kind of movement and settlement. That these are indigenous lands. It also says that if these lands are going to transfer hands, it has to be done not through individuals making deals, but through the Crown itself. And the Crown has got to be there, and it has to make sure that everything is on the up and up. This kind of and this is important because it does create the reason we have a kind of treaty-making process today, which it has to involve the Crown, in some ways dates back to that. But the important thing is that it's kind of recognizing and does actually recognize indigenous lands at this stage, and also sets up this process for fund transfer. Okay, but the Royal Proclamation does other things. Now the Treaty of Paris basically ends the war, the 7 Years' War, and it says New France will now be will now be a British possession. It'll be known as and Britain says we'll now call it Quebec. Okay, so the Treaty of Paris ends the war, but the Royal Proclamation says here's how things are going to run, and so basically it says this is going to be that Quebec is going to be run like any other British colony. Okay, that there will be an elected assembly. Okay, that the Church of England or the Anglican Church will be the state church, not the Catholic Church. It does not really recognize the seigneurial system that it existed. It said it would be a set of British laws, not recognizing kind of French common law or French criminal law, and basically said this is going to be run like any other colony. Okay, and so that's kind of that's the way it's things are going to run. Flash forward here, just a decade later, they're going to backtrack on some of that. The Quebec Act of 1774 is basically going to kind of change its mind. It's basically it's going to say that, well, actually, we're not going to have an elected assembly. It says that there are certain, the seigneurial system will be recognized, okay? Existing seigneuries will be recognized and people can kind of hang on to the land. It allows the Catholic Church to kind of collect tithes. It allows that if you're a Catholic, you could have a position in the government, which was something you couldn't have done under the Royal Proclamation. So the question is, what had happened? Well, in part it reflects the fact that there was actually a really small number of British settlers who kind of moved to Quebec after 1763. But more importantly, it also recognized it recognized the fact that in the United States there was trouble brewing. Well, it wasn't the United States. In the 13 colonies to the south, there was trouble brewing. There was pushing back about kind of British taxes. The British were kind of trying to download some of the costs of the 7 Years' War on British colonies. And so, in response, the British kind of recognized that having an ally to the north in Quebec would be useful. So, and from their perspective, the way to do that was to make sure the elites, the church, the seigneurs, the priests, the bishops, that they were all on side. And the way to do that was to throw them a bone, give them a concession, okay? And so that was the idea here. Now the folks in the British, or the British citizens who were in Quebec didn't like the idea of there not being any elected assembly, but that goes to no avail. Now, this Quebec Act, by the way, will actually be viewed by the Americans as one of the intolerable acts. One of the things that is going to lead, kind of lead to the top blowing off, the kind of pressure pot of grievances in the United States. And so moving forward here, things are going to accelerate very quickly. We move into yet another war, but this war is based largely in completely in North America, and that will be the American Revolution. The American Revolution taking place between 1774, 1776, and will end in 1783. The American Revolution is going to, it'll obviously have an impact in British North America, or the Quebec and Nova Scotia. In fact, Quebec or Montreal is actually going to be attacked, but unsuccessfully at the very outset of the conflict. Nova Scotia has to make a decision, and many folks thought actually that the Nova Scotians would side with the 13 colonies who were rebelling, in part because, and we didn't talk about these folks, but in the right after the Acadians had been deported, there was the arrival of a bunch of New Englanders known as the planters who kind of came to Nova Scotia. And so there were many people in the 13 colonies thought that Nova Scotia would easily come on side, but they didn't, for a range of reasons. Some have to do with distance, some have to do with the fact that the Royal Navy was in Halifax, but so the Nova Scotia doesn't join. But the war, which will, or the American Revolution, which will end in 1783, is actually, it's the impact that it's going to have on British North America or Canada is not necessarily in terms of lost territory or kind of battles. It's going to be on the fact that it's going to result in a wave of immigration afterwards. And Dr. Burchett's going to talk to you about that in a second. So I'm just going to end this section, but I just want to kind of, if we kind of look at those big periods again, if I can just lead you through them, just so you can follow me. So here's what we've looked at. This period of early contact, which I would say kind of takes us to 1649, okay? Next, we have the establishment of New France as a kind of a royal colony here from 1663, and really that's going to take us right up until the 7 Years' War and the fall of Quebec in 1759, 1760. And with that, the era of New France ends, and we see the beginning of British North America. The British North America that will form the basis of Canada, which will be formed in